Imagine giving someone the best years of your life. The late nights, the second jobs, the prayers they never heard. Imagine raising their children, ironing their suits, sitting quietly while they took the credit for the dreams you helped build. Now imagine being told, after 40 years of sacrifice, that you no longer fit into the picture, that someone new, someone softer, younger, less complicated, deserves more respect. That's what happened to me. He said it like I was a helper, like I'd only been passing through. But I wasn't just a chapter in his story. I was the one who wrote the prologue. Stick around. Because the same woman he cast aside? She's the one who knew exactly where all the strings were tied. And when the dust settled, he realized too late that I wasn't just the past. I was the foundation. Have you ever trusted the wrong person? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next. It didn't happen all at once. Not like in the movies where everything shatters in a single scream or a slammed door. No, this kind of heartbreak took its time. It grew slowly, quietly, tucked between dinner parties and clinic invoices, stitched into the fabric of morning routines and anniversary cards that stopped coming. It was in the way he stopped saying thank you when I handed him his favorite tie, in the way he no longer touched the small of my back as we walked into a room. It wasn't a storm, it was a drought. For 40 years, I gave my life to a man named Marcus. I gave not because I had to, but because I believed we were building something together. A legacy, a home, a future neither of us could claim without the other. That's what I told myself each time I held him up after a loss, celebrated with him after a win, and sat in silence while he basked in attention from everyone else in the room. But loyalty doesn't guarantee you a seat at the table when the power shifts. Sometimes, it just makes you easier to overlook. When Marcus and I met, he was nothing more than a determined medical student with shaky hands and a grand dream. I saw his potential before the world ever did. I used my salary to pay our first rent, sold my jewelry to help him open his first clinic. I was the one folding brochures late into the night, wiping his brow during long shifts, whispering scriptures over him when doubt threatened to swallow him whole. Back then, there was no Melinda, just me and him, Evelyn and Marcus, a team. That's what I believed. But teams don't discard their captains mid-game. And Marcus did just that. The betrayal didn't start with Melinda. It started with forgetfulness. Forgetting who prayed him through his first malpractice scare. Forgetting who sold her family land to fund the expansion. Forgetting who sat beside him, not in public, but in the quiet when no one else could see. And yet, when Melinda came along, polished and new, the world saw only her smile, her youth, her sparkle. What they didn't see were the invisible footprints I left in every corner of his success. They say when a man climbs, he sometimes forgets the ladder he used to rise. I was that ladder. I carried weight, supported him when he was weak, and stayed grounded so he could stretch toward the sky. And when he no longer needed me, he stepped right over. The sentence was short, cruel, and surgical. Evelyn, you need to pack your things. That's how 40 years of love, labor, and loyalty were erased. Not with a confrontation, not even with an argument. Just an instruction. Just a name, Melinda, spoken with more warmth than he'd offered me in years. But this story isn't just about betrayal. It's about what happens when the quiet woman, the background supporter, the forgotten wife, starts remembering. Remembering her name, her contributions, her worth. It's about what unfolds when the one who was dismissed turns out to be the one who kept the receipts, not just emotionally, but legally, financially, historically. Because you can erase a person from a photo wall. You can take down wedding portraits, replace toothbrushes, even rewrite stories at the dinner table. But you cannot erase the truth. Not when it's documented. This is not the story of a bitter woman. This is the story of a woman who believed too deeply, gave too freely, and stood too silently, until she didn't. This is my story, and Marcus never saw it coming. The corners of the sheets were still warm from the iron. I'd folded them like I always did, tight, square, precise. Just the way he liked. 40 years of doing it that way, without needing to be told. My hands moved on their own now, muscle memory shaped by years of habit, of love, of quiet sacrifice. The house was quiet that afternoon, too quiet. I used to welcome the silence. It meant peace, meant he was working in his study or reading the newspaper in his recliner. But now, it felt different. Hollow. The kind of silence that creeps up your spine and makes the walls feel like strangers. I stood at the foot of the bed for a while longer, just looking around. The drapes, the cedar chest, the picture of us from the fundraiser in '03. Everything looked like it belonged to someone else. And maybe it did now. I adjusted the frame out of instinct, even though the glass was smudged and my reflection stared back at me like a woman I didn't recognize. Marcus walked in, just as I was smoothing the top sheet. He didn't knock. He never did. His hands were stuffed in the pockets of those navy blue slacks I bought him last Christmas. He'd said he didn't like gifts, but he wore them anyway, like he couldn't bring himself to say no out loud. "Evelyn," he said, not even meeting my eyes, "you need to pack your things." I thought he was joking, truly. I even let out a little laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. I'd lived here longer than the paint on the walls. I knew where the floor creaked, which faucet needed an extra turn, which drawer stuck when it got humid. I was the one who kept the receipts, who remembered birthdays, who tucked notes into his coat pockets before board meetings. But Marcus didn't laugh. He stayed still, eyes fixed on the window behind me like he couldn't bear to see my face. "Melinda deserves more respect," he added, calm and cold, like I was an item on his to-do list. This is her home now. My ears started to ring, that high-pitched kind of ringing that drowns out everything except the thud of your own heart. Except mine didn't thud. It just paused. I stood there, frozen, with the sheet still in my hand, knuckles tight around the edge like it was the only thing keeping me upright. I wanted to ask when she started calling it home. I wanted to scream, to remind him that I'd mopped every floor, patched every pipe, defended him when even his own mother doubted his plans. But I didn't. I just stood there, realizing that everything I had folded, everything I had built, was being given away like a hand-me-down. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't just a goodbye. It was a rewrite of the entire story, and he was handing the pen to someone else. He said it again, slower this time, like he thought I hadn't heard him the first. "Evelyn, you need to pack your things." The syllables fell flat between us, not sharp, not cruel, just hollow. Practiced, as if he'd gone over them in his head so many times that they'd lost all their weight. But they hadn't lost their power. Not for me. I looked at him then. Really looked. The man I married wasn't there. This was someone else. Someone colder, more polished, with a carefully ironed shirt that I didn't recognize, and cologne that wasn't the one I used to buy. Even his shoes looked different, like they belonged to a man who didn't need to remember where he came from. "Is she here?" I asked quietly. My voice was steady, though my hands trembled at my sides. Not from fear, but from the slow unraveling of a life that had been woven so tightly, it never occurred to me it could come apart in a single sentence. He didn't answer right away, just shifted, looked past me again. That silence, God, that silence, was more honest than anything he could have said. It told me she'd been here, that maybe she had even stood in this room. Maybe she'd picked out new throw pillows or opened my side of the closet. Maybe she'd laughed in my kitchen. "I didn't want it to happen like this," he said finally, as if that changed anything. As if his regret was supposed to soften the blow of being cast out of a life I helped him build from scratch. From nothing. I wanted to ask him how long. I wanted to ask if she'd ever sat on the back porch swing, the one we'd picked out together after his first bonus check. I wanted to ask if she knew how he liked his tea, if she'd ever seen the way his left eye twitches when he lies. But instead, I sat down at the edge of the bed, the same spot I'd been in when he first said the words, and I looked at my hands. They were aging now, the veins more visible, the skin thinner. 40 years of holding babies, folding clothes, wiping away tears. His, mine, ours. Hands that used to hold his face during long nights when he doubted himself. Hands that worked when he dreamed. Hands that made his dreams livable. I had built this life one small decision at a time. Every packed lunch. Every apology made on his behalf. Every prayer whispered when he couldn't sleep. And now I was being told to erase myself from the story, like I was a wrong answer on a test. "I'll give you time," he said, already halfway out the door. But he didn't wait for me to respond. Because deep down, Marcus knew the truth. I wouldn't cause a scene. I never did. I was the quiet strength behind his name, and he was counting on that silence now. What he didn't count on was what silence can do when it's finished being loyal. He said it like he was talking about a house guest, like I'd accidentally left someone's name off a dinner invitation. "Melinda deserves more respect," he told me, and I stood there wondering how respect could be used as a weapon. How a word I once taught our sons to live by had been twisted into a reason to throw me out. Respect. I used to think I knew what that meant. I thought it meant waiting up through surgeries that ran late into the night. I thought it meant defending him at PTA meetings when parents whispered about how he was never around. I thought it meant forgiving him when he missed anniversaries, birthdays, and Christmas mornings, because I knew he was building something. And I believed, foolishly, that I was part of that something. But now, standing in the hallway of a home I had designed room by room, he was offering that word to someone else like a consolation prize. Melinda, the woman who showed up with polished nails and a polite smile, calling him Marcus, like she'd known him her whole life. I don't know when it started. I only know when it became undeniable. It was in the way he started checking his phone at dinner, the way his scent changed from wood and musk to something sharper, unfamiliar, the way he stopped finishing his sentences with Ev. "She's not comfortable with you here," he said, and that was when I realized it. This wasn't about Melinda's comfort. This was about his convenience. It was easier to displace me than to face what we had lived through. Easier to call it respect than to call it betrayal. I opened my mouth to ask something, anything, but nothing came out. I just looked at him, this man whose laugh I used to trace like scripture, and I saw someone I didn't know anymore. A man who had decided that loyalty was negotiable, that history could be overwritten by preference. She deserves more respect. But what about me? Didn't I deserve the same? Didn't I earn at least a moment of truth before being replaced? Or had I become so much a part of the furniture that removing me felt no different than swapping out a rug? He didn't wait for an answer, just adjusted his cuff and turned away, like this was a boardroom decision and not the unraveling of a woman's life. I watched his back retreat down the hallway, and I remembered the first time I saw him walk away. It was after our first fight, years ago, when he needed space. Back then, he came back. This time, I knew he wouldn't. And yet, I didn't cry. Not then, because something colder than heartbreak had settled into my chest. something sharp, quiet, and alive. He thought he was giving Melinda respect, but what he'd given me was freedom. And he would regret that far more than he ever imagined. The walls knew me. Every scuff mark on the hallway, every faded spot on the carpet. It all told a story I lived inside for 40 years. This was once our house, Marcus. The place where laughter bounced off the ceilings, where tears soaked into the couch cushions, where I stayed awake long after you'd fallen asleep, waiting for your breathing to even out. I had made this house a home with my hands and my heart. But when he said those words, Melinda deserves more respect, I looked around the rooms and realized they no longer belonged to me. The photographs on the mantelpiece, once filled with pictures of us, had new faces smiling back. Fresh flowers in the vase smelled like someone else's hands had arranged them. Even the keys in my hand felt foreign. I walked through the living room slowly, tracing my fingers along the edge of the bookshelf. The novels I had picked out, the ones we read together on quiet Sunday afternoons. They were still here, but the silence told me they were just decoration now. Nothing more. I paused by the window, the one we'd painted together when the walls were bare and the future seemed wide open. The sunlight spilled in, highlighting the dust particles dancing in the air. Little reminders that time didn't stop just because everything else did. I thought about all the plans we made in this room, the late-night talks about dreams and fears, and what life might look like when the kids were grown. They say a house is just a building, but a home is where love lives. What happens when that love is no longer welcome? Marcus didn't just hand me an eviction. He tore through the years, pulling apart the foundation we'd built, brick by brick. It was as if every meal I cooked, every birthday I remembered, every sacrifice I made could be wiped away with a single sentence. I remembered the first time I walked through the door, young and hopeful, holding my suitcase tight. The same walls that now echoed with someone else's laughter had witnessed my promises, my dreams, my determination to make this place ours. Now, I was just a visitor in my own story. But homes don't forget who built them. I looked around once more, knowing this house could hold many lives, but only one history. The history I lived. The quiet strength behind every decision Marcus took for granted. When they said I had to leave, they forgot one thing. I was the heartbeat that kept this place alive. The one who stayed when it was easier to run. The one who believed when no one else did. This was once our house, Marcus. And even if you don't see it now, it will always carry my footsteps, my laughter, and yes, even my tears. Because a home isn't just bricks and mortar. It's every moment lived within it. And I lived here, for 40 years and more. I remember the day I handed him the keys to his first car like it was yesterday. It was a beat-up old sedan, nothing fancy, but it was his. I'd saved every extra naira I could from my part-time job, skipping lunches and mending my own clothes, just to make sure he could have that small taste of independence. I watched the pride in his eyes when he held those keys, the way his smile stretched a little wider, the way he walked just a little taller. That car was more than just metal and rubber. It was a symbol of the life we were building together. A life I helped shape from the ground up, often behind the scenes. I wasn't just a wife or a mother. I was the quiet force pushing him forward when doubts crept in. I bought his first car. I paid his first rent when he moved into that tiny apartment across town, the one where the paint peeled and the plumbing was unreliable. I wanted him to have a place to call his own, a foundation where he could dream bigger, work harder. Every sacrifice I made was wrapped in love, even when it went unnoticed. I didn't keep a ledger of favors or sacrifices. I just believed that what I gave would come back to us in ways neither of us could imagine. I sewed his torn shirts, packed his lunch every morning, and stayed up late nursing him back from colds that kept him from his early meetings. I was the constant in his chaotic world, the shadow he leaned on without realizing it. But when Melinda came along, it felt like everything I'd built was being erased. Like the car I bought, the rent I paid, the nights I stayed awake, didn't mean a thing anymore. He stopped calling me Evelyn, the name he once whispered like a prayer in the quiet moments. He stopped asking how my day went. The respect I thought we had was replaced by silence and cold shoulders. I asked myself how someone could take all you gave, 40 years of loyalty, countless sacrifices, and then turn around and say it wasn't enough. How someone you loved could decide that another woman deserved more respect than you did. But here's what they don't tell you. The woman who buys the first car, who pays the first rent, who stays up through every storm, is not just a chapter in a man's story. She's the foundation. And foundations don't crumble without leaving cracks. I wasn't angry, not then. I was stunned, like waking from a long dream only to find the bed empty and cold. But that quiet shock fueled something inside me, a fire that no new respect, no new wife could ever put out. Because the truth is, you can't erase 40 years of care and calling with a sentence. You can't rewrite history with a few words. I bought his first car and paid his first rent. And even though he no longer sees it, those acts are still part of who he is, part of the man he became. And no one can take that away, not even Melinda. He didn't give me a ring, not even a goodbye. The silence between us said everything louder than words ever could. 40 years of marriage, and not once did he stop to look back. Not once did he offer a farewell, a token, or even a glance that said, "I'm sorry." Just the quiet closing of a door I thought would always be open. I sat in the living room that evening, the same one where we had danced to our favorite songs, where our children's laughter had filled the corners. The space felt hollow, stripped of the warmth I once brought into it. There were no flowers, no notes left behind. Nothing. Just a stillness that pressed against my chest. I kept waiting for something, a call, a message, a knock on the door. But it never came. It was as if my presence had become a mistake, a page torn out and discarded without ceremony. I thought back to the early days, the way he slipped a simple gold band onto my finger, promising forever. That ring meant more than metal. It was the symbol of our journey, the battles we'd fought side by side, the dreams we had sown together. And now, here I was, without even the faintest trace of that promise. I remember the nights I waited up when he was late, my heart pounding with worry. I was the one who stood through storms, who held the family steady when everything else wobbled. Yet when it was time for him to leave, it was as if I had been invisible all along. Melinda didn't get a ring either, at least, not one I was told about. But she did get the respect, the space, the quiet acceptance that I was meant to be erased. It's strange how something so small, a ring, a word, a look, can carry so much weight. How absence of these things can hurt deeper than the loudest betrayal. I wasn't angry at first, just numb, like the world had shifted beneath my feet, and I was left clutching at air. But as the days stretched on without any sign that he cared, the numbness turned cold. Not a ring, not even a farewell. The woman who gave him 40 years, her youth, her strength, her heart, was sent away without so much as a glance back. No acknowledgement of the sacrifices, the tears, the love. But here's the thing. I don't need a ring to remember what we had. I don't need a farewell to know my worth. Because what we built, our life, was real, even if he tried to pretend otherwise. And no absence, no silence, no erasure can take that from me. I was the first one to believe in him. Before the applause, before the bright lights and glossy headlines, before the world knew his name, I saw something in him that others overlooked. I believed in Marcus when he was just a young man with big dreams and empty pockets, when his only promise was to work harder than anyone else, and when all he had was faith and a stubborn heart. I watched him rise from nothing, carrying hope like a fragile flame. While others doubted, I stood by him. I was there when the nights stretched long, and the failures piled up like stones we had to climb over. I held his hand when his confidence wavered, whispered encouragement when the world told him no. I was his quiet anchor, the one who never questioned the impossible, because I believed we could conquer it together. They don't tell you how lonely it can get to be the one who believes first. How heavy the silence is when the world turns its back. How sharp the sting when even your closest friends start shaking their heads, saying, "It's a waste of time." But I stayed. I stayed because I saw the man he could be, not just the one he was. When Marcus finally started to shine, the world came rushing in. Smiles, handshakes, invitations. They wanted pieces of his success, flashes of his newfound glory. But they forgot the woman who had held the foundation steady, who had folded every sacrifice into silent prayers, who had built the house while he laid the bricks of his empire. And then, one day, the woman who believed in him first became the one he dismissed last. Melinda didn't witness those hard years. She never saw the empty plates, the sleepless nights, the whispered dreams that only we shared in the dark. She didn't hear the prayers I whispered for him, the promises I made silently to keep believing when everything felt lost. Yet somehow, she became the one he said deserved more respect. I wondered if he even remembered the woman who was there before the world applauded, the one who believed in him when no one else did, who loved him when it was easier to walk away. The woman who sacrificed pieces of herself so he could grow. It hurt, yes. But beneath the pain, a quiet strength took root. Because believing in someone first is not just about waiting for their success. It's about knowing your own worth all along. It's about understanding that your faith is a gift, not a debt to be repaid with silence or dismissal. I am that woman, the one who believed in him before the world did. And no new respect, no new face can erase the years I gave, the love I poured, or the truth that I was his first home. They may try to rewrite the story, but I know who I am, and that is enough. I walked into the clinic one afternoon, the place we had built together, a place where his dreams had taken shape, and where I'd quietly held everything together behind the scenes. It was my second home for years. Morning coffees at the reception, evenings helping with paperwork, countless hours supporting his vision when no one else cared to. That day, my eyes caught something I wasn't prepared for. The photo wall, the one where pictures of the founding team hung proudly, smiling faces frozen in time. Faces that told the story of struggle, dedication, and triumph. Except, my picture was gone. In its place was Melinda's face, bright and polished, framed like a trophy. A stranger's smile staring back at me from the wall where I used to be. I blinked, thinking maybe I was mistaken. I touched the spot, cold glass beneath my fingertips. But no, my photo had been taken down, replaced. I felt a strange hollow ache. It wasn't just about the image. It was about the story that vanished with it. The late nights I stayed to organize patient files, the phone calls I answered when the clinic was drowning in chaos, the sacrifices made so the business could grow. I had been part of this place from the beginning. I was there when Marcus took his first hesitant steps as a doctor, when the clinic was just a small room with cracked tiles and an old waiting bench. I was the one who cheered the loudest when the second center opened, the one who cried quietly when funds ran low and patients kept coming. And yet, with one small change on the wall, I was erased. Melinda's face smiled down, as if she had built this from the ground up, as if she had been there through the storms and the victories. The truth was clear. My years of loyalty, sweat, and love didn't count anymore. I was a ghost in a place I had helped breathe life into. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the silence around me was deafening. No explanations, no apologies, just the quiet replacement of one woman's presence with another's. It was more than just a photo. It was the message that my role, my value, was no longer recognized. The acknowledgement that my contributions could be wiped away without a word. I sat down in the waiting room, hands trembling. How do you reconcile being made invisible in the place you gave your heart to? How do you accept that loyalty means less than a fresh face and a prettier smile? But even as the pain settled in, a resolve grew inside me. They could take down the photo, but they could not erase the foundation I helped build. The clinic still carried my fingerprints, in its walls, in its systems, in the lives it touched. I may no longer be on that wall, but I am still part of the story. And one day, those who forgot the beginning will remember who stood through the hardest parts. Because some things aren't visible in pictures. They're etched deep into the soul of a place and the hearts of the people who built it. I never imagined the day would come when I'd be cooking for her, the woman who had taken my place in his life, the one whose name wasn't whispered, but shouted in every secret corner. Yet there I was, standing in the kitchen I had cleaned and cared for, chopping vegetables and stirring pots, all while my heart was breaking in silence. He asked me to prepare dinner for Melinda, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Make it nice," he said casually, like he was ordering lunch for a colleague, not for the woman who had replaced me. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat, pretending the knife in my hand didn't tremble. Every slice of onion felt like a betrayal. Every sizzle on the stove was a reminder that the home we built was no longer mine. I thought about the countless meals I had cooked for Marcus over the years, the breakfasts packed with love before dawn, the dinners we shared in laughter and tears. How those moments were once sacred. Now they felt like a stage where I played the forgotten role. As I set the table, I remembered the nights he came home tired, and I would greet him with his favorite dish, hoping to ease his burdens. I remembered the holidays where I cooked for our family, the prayers whispered over food that held us together. And now, that same kitchen was a place where I served the woman he wanted to honor, while I sat on the sidelines, invisible and unheard. When Melinda arrived, she smiled politely, unaware or perhaps indifferent to the storm swirling inside me. She thanked me softly, her words polite but distant. I nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. The woman who once wore my dresses, sat in my chair, now ate the meals I prepared. Cooking for her felt like folding myself into a shape I no longer recognized. Like I was shrinking, fading into a shadow of what I once was. Yet, I didn't speak up. I didn't protest. Because sometimes silence is the loudest cry. That night, as the house settled into uneasy quiet, I wondered how love could become so complicated, how loyalty could be met with such coldness, how the hands that once held mine could now ask me to nurture the very presence that replaced me. But even in that moment of heartache, a part of me understood something powerful. I was still capable of kindness, strength, and grace. I could cook for her, yes, but that didn't mean I was defeated. It meant I was bigger than the pain, larger than the betrayal. I cooked that meal with a steady hand and a quiet dignity, knowing that no matter where life took me, my worth wasn't tied to his approval or the place I held in his world. Because the woman who once cooked for love is still the woman who will cook for herself. One day, on her own terms. I didn't fight. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was too shocked, too hollowed out to even raise my voice. I was erased, wiped away like a forgotten sentence in a story I had spent decades writing. 40 years of loyalty, love, and sacrifice, gone with barely a whisper. It wasn't a dramatic scene, no shouting matches or slammed doors. It was quieter than that. So quiet it almost felt like I was fading away on my own, dissolving into the background while the world moved on without me. I watched as my place in his life was quietly taken from me, piece by piece. My name disappeared from the deeds, my photos taken down, my presence in the clinic ignored. Friends and family who once acknowledged me like part of the foundation suddenly acted as if I never existed. I became a ghost in the story I helped build. And still, I didn't fight. Part of me wondered why. Was it exhaustion? Or was it the crushing weight of disbelief that kept me silent? How do you argue when the person you gave everything to doesn't even see you anymore? They say silence is consent, but my silence was survival. I had no energy left to battle shadows and echoes. I was too busy trying to hold myself together while everything I knew was being torn apart. He didn't need to raise his voice to erase me. A few words, a glance, a cold dismissal. That was enough. The power to undo a lifetime of memories and commitments rested in his hands, and he used it without hesitation. I was there when he built his dreams, but when those dreams changed, I was no longer part of the picture. I wasn't angry at first, just numb, confused, and deeply hurt. But beneath the hurt, a quiet fire began to burn. Because even though I was erased without a fight, that didn't mean I was defeated. I learned that sometimes, standing your ground doesn't mean shouting the loudest. Sometimes it means holding on to your dignity when the world tries to steal it. Sometimes it means walking away with your head high, knowing your worth isn't defined by someone else's recognition. The hardest part wasn't being erased. It was realizing that after all those years, I had to become my own witness. I had to remind myself who I was when no one else would. I was a woman who gave her youth, her strength, her heart. A woman who built, loved, and believed fiercely. A woman who deserved more than to be quietly pushed aside. And though they erased my place in their lives, they could never erase what I carried inside. The memories, the lessons, and the unbreakable spirit that still beats within me. I was erased without a fight, yes. But I am still here, still standing, still worthy. I never thought I would see that dress again, not worn by me, but by her. The dress I once painstakingly sewed with my own hands, every stitch a piece of my hope, my dreams, and the future I imagined. I had picked the fabric myself, soft and elegant, a quiet celebration of the life I had built alongside Marcus. And there she was, Melinda, wearing it like it was made for her, as if she had earned the right to it. I remember the day I first made that dress. It was a symbol, a promise to myself that I mattered, that after years of sacrifice, I would still have moments of beauty, dignity, and grace. I wore it with pride on special occasions, feeling like I had woven my strength into every thread. But now, seeing Melinda in it felt like a silent knife twisting inside. Not because she wore the dress, but because it reminded me of all the places I no longer had in his life. That dress became more than fabric. It was a token of what was taken from me. She smiled as if unaware of the history in those folds, unaware that the hands that once crafted it had been pushed aside. She laughed in it, sat in my chair, walked through the rooms I had filled with memories. It was as if the life I had built was being worn over and erased by someone else's footsteps. I wanted to ask how it felt, to wear the hopes of another woman like a borrowed crown. But I stayed silent. There was no room for confrontation, no space for bitterness. Not yet. In that moment, I realized something painful, but true. The things we create, the sacrifices we make, they don't always stay ours. They can be claimed by others, repurposed, rewritten. Yet, beneath the ache, a quiet strength rose. Because a dress, no matter how beautiful, can only cover the surface. It cannot hold the years of love, the nights of prayers, the sweat and tears that shaped the woman who made it. I am more than the dress I wore, more than the fabric she drapes herself in. My story is woven in places no dress can touch. The quiet mornings I woke before dawn, the dreams I nurtured when no one believed, the love I gave without expectation. Melinda may wear that dress now, but she cannot wear my history. She cannot carry the weight of all I endured and all I became. And someday, I will make a new dress. Not for anyone else, but for me. One stitched with freedom, resilience, and the knowledge that my worth is not tied to what others take or leave behind. For now, I watch quietly, knowing that the woman who once sewed that dress is still here, stronger and more whole than ever. The glasses clinked before I even realized what I was hearing. Soft laughter echoed through the hallway, floating into the kitchen where I stood frozen, dish towel in hand. It was a sound I had once known so well: joy, celebration, warmth. But tonight, it sounded different. It sounded like I was listening from the outside. Marcus's voice rang out first, low and confident. Melinda's laugh followed, light and delicate, wrapping itself around his words like she had always belonged there. I edged closer to the doorway, not out of curiosity, but because I needed to know what had become of the space I had poured myself into. There they were, in the living room I once decorated, sitting on the cushions I had carefully picked out, beneath the light fixture I'd saved months to afford. Candles flickered on the mantelpiece I had dusted 100 times, casting a golden glow on the faces that didn't include mine. He raised his glass to her, something about new beginnings and beautiful futures. I didn't catch every word. My ears were ringing too loudly with all the things left unsaid. I stood behind the half wall, close enough to smell the wine, far enough to feel like a stranger. They toasted in the home I scrubbed, the floors I had knelt over, the corners I had chased cobwebs from with tired hands, the windows I had opened to let in the morning light on days when we still believed in forever. Melinda leaned into him, smiling like she had found everything she ever wanted. Maybe she had. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe Marcus hadn't told her that the very walls surrounding her were built with the quiet strength of a woman who gave her entire self to help someone else rise. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did, and chose not to. Either way, he kept pouring, kept smiling, like I was invisible. Like I hadn't once stood in that same room, toasting his first big medical award with trembling pride in my eyes. I didn't interrupt. I didn't say a word. I just watched, one hand gripping the kitchen counter to steady myself. I had already learned that not every moment deserves a scene. Some wounds don't scream, they just sink in. And yet, in the ache of that moment, something broke and something awakened. Yes, they were celebrating. But they were doing it on a foundation I helped build. You can invite someone new into a house, paint the walls, light the candles, even toast to the future. But you cannot erase the hands that made the space a home. I wiped the counter one last time that night, slower than usual. And as their laughter carried on without me, I understood that what I gave would always remain. Not in their glasses, not in their celebration, but in the soul of that house. Because I scrubbed it with love. And love, no matter how dismissed, always leaves a mark. The bag was black and crinkled at the top, sitting by the curb like all the others. At first, I didn't notice it. I had only stepped outside to water the potted lilies by the porch. Lilies I'd planted years ago, back when this house still felt like ours. The morning light caught a shimmer of gold peeking from the torn edge of plastic, and something in my chest stirred. I bent down, curious, cautious. What I pulled out didn't make sense at first. A corner of a photo frame, the kind we picked together at that little market on our honeymoon. My fingers moved faster than my thoughts. One picture, then another. My veil, his tux, the old church, the bouquet I had clutched so tightly in my nervous hands. Our smiles, wide, unknowing, full of the kind of trust that makes your knees go soft. They were all there, stuffed into a trash bag like leftovers from a party no one remembered throwing. I didn't cry. Not then. I just sat beside it, the bag gaping open, letting the past spill out onto the driveway. It was strange how heavy something could feel when it no longer had a place. There was one photo in particular, my favorite. We were standing outside the reception hall, the sun casting a soft glow on Marcus's face. He was looking at me, not the camera. I remember that moment because he whispered, "I'll never let you go." The irony burned now, the same way my fingers did from gripping the edge of that frame too tightly. He could have at least handed them to me, placed them in a box, left them on the table. But no, he threw them out, tossed our vows, our beginnings, our promises into the trash without a second glance, like they were too heavy to carry into this new life he had with her. I wondered if Melinda knew, if she saw him do it, if she even cared. Maybe to her, those photos were just relics of a past that no longer mattered. But to me, they were proof that I had existed in his world, proof that once I was chosen. I gathered them slowly, not out of desperation, but out of quiet defiance. These were mine. The memories, the love, the woman I was in those pictures. She still lived somewhere in me, even if he tried to bury her beneath a plastic bag and yesterday's trash. I didn't take them back inside. I sat with them. I laid them out on the grass, letting the sun dry what little morning dew clung to the frames. I whispered to the girl in the white dress, told her she had no idea how strong she'd have to be. And I promised her that she wouldn't be forgotten, even if he tried to erase her, even if her wedding photos ended up by the curb. It was such a small thing, barely a whisper, really. But I remember it with more clarity than I remember our anniversary dinners or the first time he kissed me in the rain. Maybe because it was the last time I heard my name, not the one everyone else used, but the one he gave me. Ev. It used to roll off his tongue like second nature. At dinner tables, across hallways, in the hush of late-night conversations when the world felt too big and only we existed. Ev, where did you put the keys? Ev, come see this sunset. Ev, I need you. But that morning, it felt different. We were in the kitchen. I was making toast the way he liked it. One slice slightly burnt, one golden. Habit, muscle memory. Love, maybe, still trying to hold on in the quiet spaces. He walked in behind me, dressed sharply in a new suit I didn't recognize. The kind of confident stride men wear when they're no longer tethered to the past. I turned to say something, maybe ask about his meeting, maybe about the weather. I don't even remember anymore. And that's when he said it. Ev, can we talk? Just like that. Software almost tender. And for a fleeting second, I was back in our early years, when saying my name meant something. I looked up, startled by the sound of it. He hadn't called me that in months. Not since Melinda started spending more time around the house. Not since his eyes began drifting elsewhere even when he sat across from me. But there it was. One last time. We talked, but not really. He said the things men say when they've already made up their minds. That he didn't want to hurt me. That life was complicated. That I deserved clarity, as if that was some kind of gift. I barely listened. All I could think about was how he had said my name, and how he might never say it again. He stopped calling me Ev after that. Went back to Evelyn, the name on my birth certificate, the one strangers and old friends used. And soon, even that became rare. Just nods, gestures, and eventually, silence. Funny how names hold so much. Ev wasn't just shorter. It was ours. It was intimate. It held years of mornings, laughter, plans whispered under bedsheets, and promises only we knew. Losing the name was like losing the last bit of oxygen in a sealed room. Quiet, invisible, but deadly. And yet, I survived it. I still hear it sometimes, late at night when I'm drifting off to sleep. Not from him, but from memory. The echo of a man who once loved me, and a woman I used to be when that name meant something. He may never say it again, but I will never forget the last time he did. She sat there like it meant nothing. Legs crossed delicately, hands folded in her lap, a soft smile on her lips, as if the room belonged to her. Maybe by law, or by some signature on paper, it did. But in my heart, that corner still bore my imprint. That chair, tucked by the bay window, facing east, wasn't just a chair. It was where I knelt for nearly 40 years. Not every morning, but most. Before the sun rose, before the house woke up. While Marcus still snored quietly in our bedroom, and the birds outside hadn't found their voices. I would settle there with a blanket across my knees and whisper things only heaven could hear. It wasn't always about Marcus. Sometimes it was about my body, tired and aching. Sometimes it was about the clinic, the bills, the weight of being needed so much that I forgot how to need myself. But most days, it was about him. Prayers for strength, for wisdom, for favor in meetings, for healing when the migraines came. I prayed him into success, prayed him through doubt, prayed for the life we built to hold steady when everything outside trembled. And now she sat in that same chair, flipping through a magazine, humming a tune I didn't recognize. Her feet were in the exact spot where I once bowed my head. Her presence in that sacred place felt like a betrayal, like she had waltzed into a temple, unaware it had ever been holy. She wouldn't know, of course. How could she? No one ever tells the second woman where the first one cried. I stood at the doorway longer than I should have, not watching her exactly, just trying to remember who I used to be in that space. The Evelyn who still believed love was forever. The woman who thought kneeling in that corner meant God was weaving protection around her home. Did she feel it? I wondered. That weight in the air? The residue of so many whispered hopes? Or had the sacred already been swept away, dusted off like an old rug before she arrived? She looked up once and smiled at me. Not cruelly, just politely, like a stranger might at a dinner party. And I smiled back, an automatic, tired reflex. I didn't say a word, didn't mention that her chair was once my altar. What would be the point? I turned and walked away, but a part of me stayed there, kneeling, uninvited, but still present. Because some prayers never leave. They linger, stubborn as breath, waiting to be remembered. And maybe one day, when the silence grows thick and the walls begin to speak, she'll feel it too. Not guilt, not shame, just a quiet knowing that she sat where another woman once poured out her soul. And maybe, just maybe, she'll understand that not all thrones are made of gold. Some are built from devotion, and some seats, no matter how gently you occupy them, will always remember the one who prayed there first. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The words landed with such certainty, they didn't need volume. I was pouring tea into the same cups I used when Marcus brought his colleagues over. Bone china, white with blue trim. A wedding gift. I was trying to be civil, trying to show that Grace still lived here, even if I was no longer welcome. Melinda sat across from me with her back straight, her fingers wrapped around the cup like she owned the table it sat on. Maybe she thought she did. Maybe by then, she did. She watched me for a moment, that polite smile women wear when they're done pretending. And then, like someone dropping a stone into a still pond, she said it. You were just his past. Not in anger, not with cruelty, just with finality, like I was a page in a book she'd already finished reading. My hand froze, mid-pour. The tea overflowed and spilled onto the saucer, but I didn't notice right away. I was too busy swallowing the weight of that sentence. Just his past. How do you respond to that? How do you explain that the past she was dismissing was 4 decades of blood, sweat, and years that clung to my skin like perfume? I wanted to tell her about the nights I sat beside him in hospital waiting rooms, clutching his hand when he feared the worst. About the meals I skipped so we could afford a clinic license. About the way I shaped him. How I was both the architect and the scaffolding, holding him up before anyone knew his name. But I said none of that. Because women like Melinda don't come for your stories. They come for your silence. She stirred her tea slowly, as if what she said hadn't shifted the ground beneath us. I looked at her and realized she didn't know what it was to build a man from the bottom up. She met him at the top of the staircase. I helped him lay the first stone. She hadn't seen his first rejection letter. She didn't know how he doubted himself in the dark, how his hands used to shake before every speech. She never wiped the sweat from his brow when the flu took him down the week of his biggest conference. She only knew the man who walked across the stage in a custom suit, not the boy who once cried on the floor when we couldn't afford rent. And yet here she was, erasing me with a sentence. I didn't cry in front of her. I won't give her that memory. But I felt something inside me shift. Not break. No, I'd done all my breaking already. This was something quieter. A turning. Like a page being marked for the last time. Let her have the table. Let her have the man who forgets. I was never just his past. I was the reason he had a future to begin with. I hadn't gone looking for it. I wasn't trying to find proof of anything. I was just sorting through old files, the kind that pile up over the decades. Receipts, warranties, faded certificates. The box was labeled Household, written in Marcus's handwriting, back when he still took the time to label things. Back when he still included me in the plans. The guest room closet had become my hiding place in the house I used to run. I told them I was packing slowly, taking my time to be respectful. But truthfully, I was trying to delay the inevitable. Leave quietly, without making it harder on myself. Without giving them the satisfaction of watching me crumble. And then I found it. The envelope was thick, yellowed at the edges, tucked between an old insurance policy and a faded blueprint of the clinic's first expansion. My fingers trembled as I pulled the deed out. Not from fear. From something else. Something like hope. Something like fury. There it was. My name. Printed clearly beside his. Evelyn Marie Thompson. He hadn't taken me off. After all the cold silences, the cruel distance, the way he stood beside her like I was a shadow he'd long stepped out of, he hadn't changed it. Midway through the page, I stopped breathing for a moment. Not because I thought this meant he still cared. No, that illusion died weeks ago. But because it was proof that I hadn't imagined the years. That I hadn't been a ghost. That at least on paper, I still mattered. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it, the way a mother might look at an old photo of the child she lost. Something sacred. Something gone. The house Melinda now walked through like a queen in her castle still legally bore the name of the woman who had scrubbed its floors, painted its walls, chosen every curtain and spoon. I picked the tile in the foyer. I chose the light fixtures in the kitchen. I fought for the garden when Marcus thought it was a waste of space. And somewhere in all of it, I must have forgotten to fight for myself. But this paper, it was a small, silent rebellion from the past. a signature that said, "She was here. She helped build this." I folded the deed gently, like it was something holy, and slid it back into the envelope. I didn't rush to tell anyone. Not yet. There's a strange kind of power in being underestimated. Melinda thought I was just his past. Marcus thought I had already let go. But this house still remembers. The walls know who cried in them. The pipes know who paid when they froze one winter. The locks remember which hands turned them first. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to demand. I had the paper. And sometimes, paper is louder than words. The lawyer's office smelled like paper and quiet power. The kind of place where things were said once, documented forever, and locked away in cabinets no one dared open. I sat across from a man in a navy suit, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and spoke in that slow, professional tone people use when they think the truth might sting too hard if it lands too fast. "Mr. Daniels signed over his share of the property last month," he said. "But your name remains on the title. Without your consent, the transfer is incomplete." For a moment, I just stared at the edge of the table. Walnut, polished, expensive. The kind of table Marcus would have admired. The kind he used to dream of owning back when our dining room was a hand-me-down with one shaky leg and a tablecloth to cover the burn mark from our first Thanksgiving turkey. His signature wasn't enough. Let that settle. He could sign 1,000 documents, whisper 1,000 promises into Melinda's ear, paint over the walls with a new shade of white that erases history. But some things are rooted too deep. You don't get to cut someone out with ink when the foundation was poured with blood and sweat. Midway through the conversation, I realized I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was still. Like I'd finally exhaled after holding my breath for years. All this time, I thought he'd taken everything from me. The house, the dignity, the name on the door. But he hadn't taken the truth. And the truth was, no matter how far he leaned into his new life, he couldn't sign me out of the one we built together. I asked the lawyer to repeat it, not because I didn't hear him the first time, but because I wanted to hear it again. Slowly, deliberately. Marcus tried to hand over what wasn't his alone. That meant something. I imagined his face when he found out the papers didn't go through. That the home he told me to pack my things in still bore my name in the county records. I wondered if Melinda would raise her voice, or if she'd do what women like her do, make it seem like my name was a stain she'd quietly cover with lavender candles and fresh paint. They thought I'd leave with my suitcase in silence. But there's a strange kind of authority in being written into the walls. The lawyer asked if I wanted to contest anything. I didn't answer right away. I just smiled, the kind of smile you wear when your enemy doesn't even know the game has started. I had no plans to fight. Not with fists, not even with words. The signature was flashy, loud, public. But mine was binding. The receptionist didn't recognize me. That stung more than I thought it would. I used to sit behind that desk when the phones rang off the hook and we couldn't afford a second line. I picked out the color of that paint, that dull cream that still peeled around the edges. But now, I was just another stranger walking in from the rain, water dripping from my sleeves, heart soaked in a memory no one else seemed to carry. "I'm here to see Dr. Daniels," I said softly. The girl nodded like I was one of many. She didn't know I was the reason there was even a Dr. Daniels to see. While I waited, I looked up. The stain was still there, right above the corner chair, the roof leak. I noticed it years ago after a storm blew through and flooded half the storage closet. Marcus swore he'd get it fixed. I ended up paying for it myself, with money from a side job I never told him about, just to keep the clinic running, just to keep him looking good. The roofer came on a Sunday, said I had kind eyes, and charged me half the going rate. I made him lunch. Midway through that thought, I realized something. After all these years, the leak never got repaired. They just painted around the stain, covered it, pretended it wasn't there, just like they did with me. Melinda had a framed photo on the wall now, the two of them, standing side by side in matching white coats. I remember when Marcus said we couldn't afford a new printer, let alone professional photos. We used to laugh about how broke we were, how we'd make it big someday. I never imagined the big would come with an erasure. And still, the roof leaked. Still, the ceiling bore the mark of something once broken, never quite fixed. That was my contribution. Things no one saw but everyone depended on. Quiet sacrifices, behind-the-scenes payments, the kind of giving that doesn't show up in grand gestures, but in phone bills paid, and pipes unclogged, and roofs patched just enough to hold. The roof wasn't the only thing that was patched. Marcus had patched over my presence with a new smile, a new wife, a new story. But the cracks still showed if you looked close enough. I walked down the hallway, counting the tiles I once scrubbed with a toothbrush when we couldn't afford a cleaner. Patients passed me without a glance. No one said thank you. No one remembered the woman who had once sewn curtains for the waiting room or stayed late to file charts by hand when the system crashed. The irony? I paid for the very thing that now pretended I never existed. But the roof still leaks. And that's how you know the story isn't over. Some stains can't be painted over. Not when the rain keeps falling. Not when the truth keeps dripping through. I still remember the first time Marcus said, "One day, I'll be more than just a neighborhood doctor." He was younger then, eager, full of ideas and empty pockets. We were sitting on a second-hand couch in our one-bedroom apartment, our dinner plates balanced on our knees, steam rising from the cheapest cut of meat the market had to offer. I believed him, not because he had proof, but because I had seen the way he carried hope like it was stitched into his spine. That night, he talked about private clinics, research wings, maybe even a foundation someday. I didn't know much about investments, but I knew dreams like his needed more than belief. They needed backing. So I started learning. Quietly. On my lunch breaks. While he slept. While he studied. When I finally bought those first stocks, they weren't in his name. They were in mine. A little tech company here, a healthcare supplier there. Nothing flashy. Nothing that looked like success. But I watched them grow, watered by time, and a kind of discipline Marcus never noticed in me, because it didn't wear lipstick or make noise. By the time his name started showing up on conference pamphlets and clinic boards, those stocks had tripled. Some even more. He never asked where the down payment for his first clinic office came from. I let him think it was the bank that finally saw his worth. But it wasn't. It was me. My little portfolio. My choices. My sacrifice. Years later, Melinda would boast about their new investments, about how smart Marcus was with money. I bit my tongue so hard it tasted like iron. Because while she was posting pictures from fundraisers in rented gowns, I was the one who had sat in a coat closet turned office, drafting budgets by candlelight during a blackout. The truth about wealth is that it remembers its roots, even when the people don't. So when I walked into my financial advisor's office last week and asked for a full report, I wasn't shocked at what I saw. Those same stocks I bought on faith, before Marcus ever made headlines, had matured into something solid, tangible, and entirely mine. Marcus always assumed I left the finances to him, that I trusted him to handle things. But the thing is, I wasn't just investing in companies. I was investing in an exit, a safety net, a future he thought I wouldn't need without him. He can keep the clinics. He can keep the speeches and the press photos and Melinda on his arm. Let him play the role. But numbers don't lie. And the statements in that binder said one thing loud and clear. The empire he stands on was partly funded by a woman he no longer bothers to name. Funny, isn't it? He had the spotlight, but I had the shares. He looked at me the way you look at an old chair you're about to throw out, like it once served a purpose, but now it just takes up space. I saw it in his eyes that day in court. That quiet arrogance. The way he leaned back, one arm stretched over the seat like he was settling into a movie he'd already seen the ending to. His lawyer kept glancing at him, waiting for some signal, but Marcus didn't flinch. Why would he? In his mind, I was done. Finished. Emptied out from years of giving. He thought I had no fight left in me. It's easy to underestimate a woman when you've only ever seen her in an apron, wiping sweat from your brow, folding your dreams into hers. When your memory of her is tied to grocery lists and laundry baskets and quiet prayers whispered in the dark. He thought my strength was domestic, my power too soft to stand in front of a judge and speak in a tone that didn't tremble. But I've been through too much to still be fragile. They forget that silence isn't surrender, it's strategy. If you're still here, thank you. This part was the hardest to tell. I let him talk. I let his lawyer present their case like I was a footnote, a formality, a ghost. I watched them pass around documents and make claims, twisting timelines, rewriting history with polished words and rehearsed concern. And then it was my turn. I stood up, not with fire, but with facts, with receipts, with dates, statements, photographs, and quiet truths that didn't need to scream to shake the room. The look on Marcus's face shifted, not all at once, but gradually, like dawn creeping in, undoing the lie of night. He hadn't prepared for me. He'd prepared for the version of me he created in his mind, a worn-out woman too broken to speak. But I wasn't broken. I was bruised and rebuilt. I was quiet, but not clueless. He never asked how I kept the lights on when the clinic almost went under. He never asked how the mortgage got paid when we fell behind. He never questioned the sudden appearance of new equipment, new staff, new furniture, because he assumed it was his charm that brought them. Not my budgeting, not my saving, not my sacrifices behind the scenes. So when I laid it all out, not to destroy him, but to correct the record, the court didn't just listen. They leaned in. Because truth, when delivered with calm and clarity, has a weight pride can't carry. Afterward, Marcus couldn't look me in the eye. Not because I had yelled or cursed or crumbled, but because I didn't. He realized too late that the woman who built him was also capable of dismantling the story he told about her. He thought I had no fight left. But he was wrong. I didn't fight to win. I fought because I remembered who I was before he forgot. Melinda walked through the house like it was already hers, fingers trailing across countertops I had scrubbed for decades, eyes darting from room to room, calculating square footage and paint options like the home was a blank canvas and not a living archive of everything I'd built with Marcus. She had on that perfume again, sharp and sweet, like citrus mixed with entitlement. It clung to the air like she was marking territory. She smiled at me that day, with the kind of grin people wear when they think they've already won. She thought the house was hers, the assets, the clinics, the name. She thought time had wiped me clean from the record, like a smudge easily erased. But what Melinda didn't know about the will could fill a book. It was written long before her hair ever graced Marcus's pillow, long before her voice replaced mine on his voicemail, long before she walked into his life carrying ambition in one hand and a ring box in the other. Marcus hadn't thought to update it. Or maybe he didn't believe I'd ever see it again. Maybe, somewhere in that proud head of his, he thought I'd just disappear. But some things, some people, can't be erased just because you closed the door. When a man forgets the promises he made, the paperwork he signed becomes louder than any vow he tries to rewrite. The lawyer found the document in a locked drawer Marcus hadn't touched in years. Still in the original envelope, still bearing both our names. everything spelled out in quiet ink. The house? Left to me? The first clinic building? Me again. The shares, the accounts, the bonds he used to leverage expansion? Every line echoed one thing. Evelyn will know what to do with this. It wasn't sentiment. It was strategy. He'd once told me, back when we were building from nothing, that he trusted no one else to manage things if something happened to him. Not his brother. Not his colleagues. Not even his future self. Just me. Melinda didn't know that kind of trust. She only knew the man he became after the spotlight found him. Refined, sharp-suited, distant. She never knew the man who wept when the bank turned him down, or who couldn't sleep without my hand pressed against his back. That man, the one who drafted the will, still remembered who held him up. So while she stood in the foyer picking out new wallpaper, I stood in the lawyer's office holding the weight of every silent contribution I'd ever made. Not a trophy, not revenge, just justice, quietly written in black and white. She may have had the husband, but I had the legacy, and the signature that still had my name beside his. It was tucked between old recipe books and the manual for a vacuum we no longer owned. A little leather-bound checkbook, worn at the corners, pages curled from years of flipping and pressing and flipping. I didn't even know I still had it until I went back to pack the last of my things. It had been there all along, quiet, patient, like so many parts of me had learned to be. Melinda walked past it without a glance, too busy giving orders to the movers. She thought she was clearing out my leftovers. What she didn't know was that she was standing on top of my records, my memories, my proof. That checkbook wasn't just a ledger. It was a timeline, a testimony. It had the down payment for Marcus's first medical equipment, the 3-month rent I paid in full when the clinic almost went under during the second year, the surprise birthday suit he never wore, but thanked me for anyway, and the emergency loan to his brother that he said he'd handle, but didn't. Some stories are written in ink. Mine was written in numbers. Each check a chapter, each tear in the paper, a line that didn't need a voice to speak. I flipped through the pages slowly, feeling the weight of every sacrifice that had no audience. The nights I cooked meals with $10 to our name. The way I stretched pennies until they looked like dimes. All those checks signed in my name, dated and torn from the spine with a prayer. And he kept them. Never tossed them. Just stacked them in drawers and files, like silent witnesses to the truth he'd later try to deny. I remember the one I wrote for his conference in Atlanta. He'd forgotten the registration deadline, and the hotel was full. I sent him with cash and my blessing. I watched him pack while telling myself this was what support looked like. I didn't know he'd meet her there. Page after page, the amounts shifted. Groceries, utilities, donations made in his name. The ink faded, but not enough to hide the fact that I'd always shown up. Always paid my share. Sometimes his too. He liked to say he was the dreamer, and I was the steady hand. What he never said was that my hand held the checkbook, the calculator, and the faith when his ran out. When the lawyer asked for evidence of financial contribution, I handed him the checkbook. No speeches, no tears. Just a small, simple ledger that told the story he tried to rewrite with shiny suits and wedding bands. Melinda may have had the new keys, but I had the receipts. And unlike words, numbers don't forget. He packed light. 2 suitcases and a smug kind of silence. Didn't even take the coffee maker we bought together in '89, or the carved lamp from our first road trip. Just his clothes, his cologne, and his sense of being owed something newer. He didn't look back. Not at me. Not at the walls I painted. Not at the life we printed into every corner of that house. But for all the things Marcus left behind, his toothbrush, his tie rack, the plant I kept alive while he forgot it existed, what he didn't realize was that he also left a trail. A paper trail. Long, detailed, and utterly unable to lie. The way he left felt surgical. Quick, clean, no stitches. As if decades could be undone with one statement and a slam of a door. "It's time we both moved on." That's what he said, as if we'd both been standing at the same finish line. But I hadn't moved. I was still mid-marathon, still holding out water and cheering him on. But love isn't the only thing that lingers after a man walks away. Sometimes what lingers is proof. Receipts in drawers, contracts in my name, insurance forms listing me as the primary, property tax letters that landed in our mailbox, both our names still staring up at me like a quiet rebellion. His new life might have begun with a kiss and a camera flash, but the old one hadn't ended the way he thought. I found an old box in the attic, marked taxes, and inside were years of returns I'd filed, sometimes alone, sometimes with him hovering nearby asking, "Do I sign here?" I did the filing. I tracked the deductions. I wrote the cover letters and mailed them with care. That wasn't just paperwork. That was partnership, no matter how he tried to forget it. Bank statements showed my direct deposits into our joint account long after his income grew wings. Credit card bills bore my name for charges he racked up on business trips with her. And even the loan application for his second clinic expansion, I signed as guarantor. Me. The woman he now treated like a footnote in his biography. Melinda could wear the ring. She could have the title. But she couldn't erase what was written in print, what was filed, what was signed. And when the time came to divide things, it wasn't his charm that mattered. It was the documents, the bank logs, the legal forms, the years of signatures, the trail he didn't bother to clean up because he never thought I'd follow it. He left me like a man walking off stage after the final bow. But he forgot that the spotlight doesn't matter if the paperwork says the show was mine all along. He left me, but not the paper trail. And that trail led straight to the truth. He stood in the doorway like a stranger, holding nothing but a soft apology and the smell of regret. Not the kind that bends low and begs, but the kind that shows up too late, like flowers on a grave. His mouth opened, his eyes searching for the version of me that used to rush to fix everything. But she wasn't home anymore. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," he said, voice low, like the house might remember and turn against him. The nerve it took to come back. To say that. After all the erasing, the replacing, the public undoing of everything we built in private. I looked at him the way silence looks at noise, unimpressed. He was expecting tears, or anger, or some version of closure that would make him feel better. But I didn't have a single word to spare. Not because I had nothing to say, but because he didn't deserve to hear it. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is nothing at all. Because silence, when earned, becomes a sentence too powerful to be pardoned. He tried to walk through the kitchen like muscle memory might open old doors. He paused at the counter where I used to leave his tea, stared at the chair he once slumped into after surgeries. I watched him try to reconcile the woman he left with the woman who now stood tall, shoulders square, eyes dry. He didn't know this version of me, the one who didn't reach, the one who didn't flinch. He talked about mistakes, about how he missed my steadiness, about how Melinda didn't understand him the way I did, about how the house felt colder without me in it. He listed things like they were reasons, not consequences. But I'd spent years hearing every version of Marcus's voice, his charm, his rage, his ambition, his guilt. I had memorized his rhythms like a favorite song, and I knew when he spoke from fear versus when he spoke from ownership. This wasn't ownership. It was self-preservation dressed up as repentance. He reached for my hand, and that's when I stepped back. Just an inch. Just enough. His face dropped. like he finally realized that forgiveness doesn't always come with an invitation to return, that apologies don't always earn amnesia. I walked him to the door without saying a word. Not a goodbye, not a take care. Just my silence, wrapped around me like armor. He turned once more before stepping out. "You're really not going to say anything?" I smiled then, not out of bitterness, but clarity. My silence wasn't emptiness. It was a boundary. It was an echo of every moment I stayed when I should have left. And this time, the leaving was mine. He strutted into that boardroom last month like he built it with bare hands. Rolled up sleeves, confident smirk, the polished tone of a man who forgot his beginnings. The others clapped when he entered. Young faces, new interns, bright-eyed doctors who only knew him as Dr. Marcus Fields, founder, pioneer, visionary. They didn't know the man who paced our tiny apartment floor all night, hands shaking, wondering how we'd secure that first loan. He didn't mention my name in his speech. Not once. Not when he talked about the early days. Not when he recounted the clinic's rise from a single rented unit to a 5-building practice. He said, "We had to fight the banks." But there was no we in the photos that followed. Just him, flanked by men in suits and a woman in red. What Marcus conveniently forgot to say was that the bank wouldn't have looked twice at his proposal if my name hadn't been signed on the dotted line right under his. My credit, my savings, my credibility with the local manager at First Union. I was the one who walked in with the paperwork clutched in trembling fingers, wearing my best blouse, and the perfume he said made me smell serious. He remembered the victory, but not the vow. The payoff, but not the price. I sat in that very bank lobby for 3 hours while he paced outside, too nervous to face the loan officer. I smiled. I answered the questions. I looked that man in the eye and said, "Yes, I believe in this." Not just the clinic, him. We signed that first loan in April, and by May I was working 2 shifts to keep the lights on in the practice. He promised me, "This is our dream." But dreams apparently shrink to one name when the money grows. He acts now like his empire sprung fully formed from the strength of his ambition. But it didn't. It was carved out of my sacrifices. My evenings at the front desk. My Saturdays handing out flyers. My Sundays helping him rehearse speeches for potential investors when no one had invested anything yet. Not even faith. That loan was our first real leap. And my name, my signature, was the bridge. But Marcus forgets that. He forgets how the risk looked smaller when I stood next to him. He forgets the nights I talked him down from giving up. How I told him, "One day, they'll thank you." And now they do. Just not me. But paper remembers what people try to erase. My name is still on that contract. And the bank still sends me the annual statements because technically, I'm still a co-signer. Legally, historically, permanently. He may forget who was with him when no one else believed. But the documents don't. And neither do I. The living room rug, Persian, navy, and rust, wasn't just a decoration. It was the first thing we bought after the lease was approved. Marcus had wanted something modern. I insisted on something warm. We compromised at a street-side vendor just off 8th, paid in cash. I remember because it was half my paycheck and all of his charm that got us a discount. He said, "We'll build a life on this rug." He wasn't lying. We did. Love built this. Not luck, not timing, not even brilliance. It was dinners skipped so he could finish night shifts. It was waking at 5 a.m. to iron his shirts before clinic openings. It was all the invisible glue, the handwritten notes in his lunchbox, the calls to vendors when he forgot, the late-night coffee runs to keep him awake while he studied for certifications. It was work. It was love. It was mine too. And the receipts? Oh, I kept them, not out of spite, just out of habit. Every invoice, every down payment, every warranty card slipped into the back of the second kitchen drawer, neatly labeled and dated. Years passed. So did seasons. Love evolved into obligation, then into routine. But the records remained, like proof that I was there, like footprints on a path now paved over. You can be written out of the story, but not out of the evidence. There's a file box in storage with our names on the side, his and mine. In it, you'll find the title deed for the first clinic branch, the one we celebrated over with leftover Chinese food because we couldn't afford steak. My signature is there, right next to his. You'll also find faded receipts for the hospital bed he wanted for his father, which we drove 3 towns over to find, and the first security deposit on the duplex that became our home. My handwriting, my account number. I remember the day the hot water heater burst. He panicked. I called the plumber, paid him in cash, saved the receipt. It's still there, stained, a corner torn, but legible. I also saved the invoice for Melinda's engagement ring. Not because I knew then, but because the joint card rang unfamiliar one day, and I checked the records. He forgot that I'm the one who always handled the filing. They call it bitterness. I call it bookkeeping. They call it obsession. I call it memory with a paper trail. When Melinda walked through that door and said, "You didn't build any of this," I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just walked to the drawer, pulled the file, and laid it gently on the marble counter she thought she picked out. She flipped through pages, her lips parting just slightly. No dramatic gasp, no apology. Just the sudden, unmistakable awareness that she was living in a house someone else helped carry. Brick by brick, inch by inch. Love built this, and I still have the receipts. The lights were too bright for a clinic ceremony. Cameras flashing, microphones clipped onto suits, and people I didn't recognize raising glasses to a man I knew better than he knew himself. They called him a visionary, a pioneer, a builder of legacies. I stood at the back. No name tag, no seat at the table. Just the quiet knowing that none of this started with the man they applauded. It started with the woman who waited. They clapped when he mentioned the first 10 years, said things like grit and relentless determination. Melinda dabbed her eyes with a tissue she probably bought just for the occasion. And Marcus, well, he smiled like he'd been in charge the whole time. But I remember who stayed up retyping his proposals when he didn't know what a semicolon was. I remember the early mornings we walked to the print shop because we couldn't afford a new cartridge for the home printer. I remember because I was there. They weren't. Patience isn't glamorous. It doesn't wear red gowns or earn standing ovations. It waits in hospital lobbies. It scrubs toilets in rented spaces before the doors open to patients. It reheats forgotten dinners. It forgives missed anniversaries. It learns to speak softly so ambition doesn't feel crowded. While they celebrated the spotlight, I learned to master the shadows. I wasn't clapping, not because I wasn't proud, but because I already had my moment. The first patient who walked in and said, "Thank you, doctor," and Marcus squeezed my hand under the desk. That was applause. The time the clinic finally broke even, and we sat on the floor eating noodles and whispering about what next year could look like. That was applause. When his mother fell sick, and I held her hand through the night while he gave a keynote speech. That was patience, and it was mine. I didn't interrupt the speeches. I didn't wave the folder of financial records. I didn't remind them that the first chairs in the waiting room were bought second-hand with my holiday bonus. I just stood there, watching, remembering. Because applause fades, echoes die in empty rooms. But patience builds cathedrals out of silence. It survives the long winters. It watches empires rise and knows which bricks are hollow. It holds the line when love becomes memory, and memory becomes fuel. Melinda kissed him on stage that night, and cameras flashed like they were capturing history. But they weren't. They were catching up to a story already written, in meals skipped, in debts paid, in nights endured. I don't need their applause. I never did. I had patience. And patience doesn't make noise. It makes legacy. He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather. You've become so bitter, Evelyn. His voice didn't shake. His eyes didn't blink. He just stood there, coffee in hand, leaning on the marble counter I chose back when we thought cold stone and warm memories could live in the same kitchen. Bitter. The word hung in the air like smoke. Not shouted, not whispered. Just dropped, like a weight he was relieved to finally put down. I didn't flinch. I didn't even frown. Because I wasn't surprised. When a man rewrites history, the ones who remember it accurately are always called difficult. I didn't slam the door or throw the mug. I rinsed it, dried it, and placed it back in the cabinet. That's what bitter women don't do. We clean up, even after being dismissed. He called me bitter because I didn't smile when I passed him in the hallway. Because I no longer asked if he'd eaten. Because I didn't pretend that Melinda's laughter in the guest room didn't echo down the walls I painted. He called me bitter because I stopped softening his guilt. The thing about being done is, it's quieter than anger, but heavier than grief. You see, bitterness is loud. It curses, it breaks dishes, it floods inboxes with long midnight messages. But I was none of that. I had moved on, just not out. Not yet. Not physically anyway. But emotionally, spiritually, soul deep. I had already packed. I didn't remind him that I sat through every board meeting before his name mattered. I didn't bring up the miscarriages. I didn't ask him why Melinda's shoes were in the hallway again. I didn't argue when he started saying my clinic instead of ours. I didn't need to. That fight was beneath me now. Bitter is holding on. But I let go. I let go when I stopped listening for his car in the driveway. I let go when I deleted the anniversary reminders from my phone. I let go when I realized I hadn't cried in 3 weeks. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I was finally empty enough to breathe. He thought bitterness would look like fury, but mine looked like calm, like clear boundaries and quiet dinners alone, like remembering I had dreams too once, ones that didn't orbit him, like walking past the old wedding photo and not feeling the need to turn it down anymore. So he called me bitter. I suppose it was easier than admitting I was done. Done being the pillar he leaned on, the shadow he forgot, the woman who made it all happen and got erased from the credits. I wasn't bitter. I was free. And freedom doesn't ask for permission to leave. It just stops waiting for someone to notice it stayed too long. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. Polished wood, stiff suits, and the quiet shuffle of papers filled the space where years of my life were about to be read back to me like footnotes. Marcus didn't look at me. Melinda sat 2 rows behind him, clutching her designer bag like it held the truth. But I didn't flinch. I had said all I needed to say, just not with my voice. I didn't scream. Not when he served me papers like I was a stranger. Not when he claimed the house, the clinic, and even the investments were his. Not when Melinda began introducing herself as Mrs. Thompson, like I never wore that name for 40 years. Number. I saved my breath. Because the courts? They don't care for volume. They care for evidence. The judge's voice was firm but almost kind. He read the financial records first. Bank transfers signed in my hand, property bought with checks from my personal account, silent contributions made long before Marcus became a name worth printing. Truth, when properly documented, doesn't need a microphone. It echoes on its own. I sat still as they opened folders bearing receipts with my initials. I watched as they displayed the original clinic lease, with both our names. They played the footage of our joint interview from a local news channel in 1996, where I sat beside him and talked about our shared vision. I hadn't seen that video in over a decade, but there I was, young, steady, hopeful. And there he was, agreeing, publicly, on record. His lawyer shifted. Melinda stopped clutching her bag. Marcus finally looked up, and for the first time in months, I saw something flicker. Not love, not regret, just the recognition that he'd underestimated silence. I didn't need to raise my voice. The records did. The deed with my name engraved beneath his did. The email trail he never deleted did. The tax forms, the business filings, the patient testimonials that still mentioned the woman at the front desk who made everything run. The judgment didn't come with confetti or celebration, just a firm nod, a division of assets, a restoration of what was already mine, and something else, something I hadn't asked for, but meant more than any number: acknowledgement. The judge said, "This court recognizes the substantial documented contributions made by Mrs. Evelyn Thompson in the establishment and maintenance of the clinic and related properties." That was it. Not loud, not poetic, just truth. Unarguable. Unshaken. I stood up when it was over, smoothed the front of my coat, walked past Marcus and Melinda without turning. I didn't scream when I got outside. I didn't cry. But I did exhale. Because silence may not shatter glass, but in the right courtroom, it moves mountains. They clapped for his rise, but they forgot who held the ladder. Now the spotlight's gone, and guess who's still standing? Not with applause, with proof, with power. It wasn't in a courtroom that I saw it. It was in the hallway, 3 weeks after the verdict had come down. The case was over, the ink had dried, and the whispers had changed direction. No more poor Evelyn, no more she should have let it go. The silence now hung in Marcus's corner, not mine. Melinda had come to the clinic that day, maybe to tighten her grip on the space, or maybe to prove to herself more than anyone that the storm hadn't rattled her. She wore the same soft beige dress she always did when she wanted to look calm. Understated, in control. But her eyes told another story. We didn't plan to meet in that hallway. I had come to sign over a final document related to the property title, the one they thought I'd forgotten about. The one that still had my name on it, legally binding, sealed with a signature from a woman who once built everything with her bare hands and folded dreams into blueprints. She came around the corner, her heels pausing when she saw me. And I did the strangest thing. I nodded. Not out of friendliness, not even out of habit. It was more like closure in motion, a punctuation mark to a sentence we both understood now. She didn't speak, but her eyes lingered. She looked at me the way someone does when a portrait on the wall suddenly begins to resemble a person they once dismissed. And that look, it didn't carry the smugness from before. It was something quieter, sharper, the kind of realization that comes too late to change anything, but still lands heavy on the heart. She used to look at me like a name in a footnote. Now she looked like she was reading the headline for the first time. I stepped aside to let her pass, not because I had to, but because I had already won. You don't need to block doors when you've already walked through your own. The court had spoken, yes. The documents had been reviewed, the history laid bare. But this was the real verdict. Not from the judge, not from the press, but from her eyes. That flicker of recognition, that sliver of knowing. She now understood that she hadn't taken something from me. She'd simply walked into a life that was never hers to own fully. I wasn't the ex-wife who lost. I was the woman whose fingerprints couldn't be wiped clean, no matter how many nameplates they replaced or walls they painted over. She adjusted the strap of her purse and walked past me, the scent of expensive perfume clinging to the silence between us. But before the door clicked behind her, she glanced back, just once. And in that glance, I saw it all. The questions she hadn't asked Marcus, the receipts she hadn't read, the story she thought she knew unraveling right there in the corridor. I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. That was never my way. Instead, I turned and walked the other direction, lighter than I'd felt in years. Some victories don't come with applause. They come with a single glance that says, "I see you now." And that day, Melinda finally did. It started with a phone call from someone I didn't recognize. A junior associate from a firm Marcus once boasted about using, calling to clarify some inconsistencies in the ownership documents of a shared asset. I almost laughed, softly, of course. There it was again. The paper trail doing the work I no longer had to. What they thought they buried beneath new filings and forgotten initials had roots. Roots with my name carved into them. See, they underestimated me because I didn't shout. I didn't slap titles across my chest or ask for applause when I signed those early contracts, or wrote the first clinic bylaws, or paid from my own account when payroll lagged. But I'd kept the receipts. Not in folders to wave in anyone's face, but in a safe place, marked by dates and dignity. When Marcus filed for full financial control of the foundation, thinking the courts would glaze over the history, it was those documents, those small but sharp sheets, that cut through the noise. Bank drafts, co-signatures, emails, notes from board meetings written in my own handwriting. Even a photo, Marcus in his first office, standing proudly behind a donated desk that had been delivered under my name. Every piece came together not to humiliate him, but to clarify something they had conveniently forgotten. I was not a footnote. I was the first chapter. And the best part? I never had to explain it out loud. The paper trail spoke fluently. It answered questions before they were asked. It forced timelines to be revised and stories to be rewritten. It also began to reach others. Quietly. People who had looked at me with pity now looked at me with pause. The woman who once arranged flowers in the waiting room had become the name on the grant that started the medical scholarship. The woman who served cake at Marcus's inaugural gala had funded half the event. My fingerprints had never vanished. They'd just been smudged under his ambition. And now they were clear again. Melinda may have walked confidently through the front door, but even she began to hesitate, especially when the legal letters came. Not hostile, just corrective. Gentle but firm, like me. Letters that reminded the world that titles may change, but ownership remembers. I didn't push anyone out. I didn't need to. I just stood where I always had, anchored in truth, and let the documents do what words couldn't. By the time the final property settlement came through, it wasn't about winning anymore. It was about being seen, being credited, being counted. Marcus didn't call. He didn't write. But I know he knew. The way someone knows when the wind changes direction. He felt the shift, even if he refused to turn and face it. And that was enough. I've learned that sometimes justice looks like a gavel. Other times it looks like a filing cabinet that's been waiting patiently to be opened. Mine had waited long enough. The story they tried to erase found its way back. Not because I chased it down, but because truth has a way of surviving fire. And as it turns out, paper might burn, but not when it's backed by a memory that refuses to be silenced. There's a silence that doesn't sting. It confirms. It's the kind that follows not just a storm, but a full reckoning. Not because there's nothing left to say, but because everything that needed saying was carved into record, signed in ink, stamped by justice. I sat on the back porch of a smaller home, lavender curling around the railings, and rosemary pushing through the cracks of the path I'd laid myself. This wasn't the estate I helped pay for. It wasn't sprawling or grand. but it was mine. And every wall held my laughter, not someone else's ambitions. I used to think peace looked like shared tea, matching robes, his and hers towels. But it turns out, peace looks more like knowing your name again. It sounds like documents read aloud in a courtroom that didn't flinch at my silence, but listened. It feels like finding the old checkbooks and realizing they weren't just records. They were proof of a presence no one could erase. Marcus never saw it coming, but then again, he never thought to look at the woman behind the counter, the one who kept the books, wrote the speeches, prepared the meals, and remembered everything. I didn't fight him when he asked me to pack my things. I didn't scream when Melinda called me history. I didn't slam doors or break glass. I simply began gathering my proof. And in the end, it spoke louder than his promises. Melinda had pearls. I had ledgers. She had parties. I had filing cabinets. She had applause. I had patience. They thought I left empty-handed, not realizing I carried the receipts, the grant co-signatures, the first clinic loan. Not because I planned to use them as weapons, but because I knew what they were. My history, my truth, filed and dated. Now the house they said I no longer belonged to carries a lien in my name. The clinic wall where my face was removed now hangs a statement of founding credit next to his. The stocks I bought when his name meant nothing now pay my monthly mortgage. And the will they never expected me to know about, well, it spoke louder than any courtroom declaration. I don't walk with vengeance. I walk with memory. Marcus may never acknowledge what we built together. Melinda may never understand what came before her. That's fine. I'm not writing this story to be seen by them. I'm writing it for every woman who folded corners, who stood quietly behind the podium, who cooked meals while documents passed hands without her name. I'm writing it for every woman who was told to pack her things, but remembered to take the truth with her. I am not bitter. I am whole. And finally, I am heard. Not through shouting, not through scandal, but through the steady unraveling of a paper trail that didn't just clear my name, it crowned it. So if they still think I lost, that I faded into some forgotten past, let them. Because the past doesn't forget the hands that built it. And this time, the ending was written with my signature at the bottom. Thank you for watching. Her story is one of survival, truth, and finally choosing herself. To hear more stories like this, click on the left, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. You are not alone in what you've lived.